There is a place in the mountains of West Virginia where the road doesn't end. It simply stops offering you a way back. Not because it breaks, not because it disappears into the trees, but because something older than the road, older than the trees, older than the name carved into the deed at the county courthouse, decided long before you arrived that you were exactly what it had been waiting for. Travelers have walked into those hills for 50 years. Surveyors, peddlers, wanderers, men with appointments to keep and families at dinner tables with empty chairs. They all went up. Not all of them came back down. In the autumn of 1923, a county recorder named Wilkin Yarrow was sent to assess an abandoned property deep in the hollows north of a forgotten mountain town. The owners were dead. There were no heirs. The land belonged to the county now, and the county needed a number on it. It was a simple errand, a morning's work. The kind of thing Wilkin had done 100 times in 20 years of running his fingers across deed books and other people's lives reduced to ink. He believed in columns of numbers. He believed in paperwork. He did not believe in anything that paperwork couldn't explain. The woman at the general store told him 3 things before he walked out the door. Don't eat at their table, don't sit in their chairs, and don't stay past sundown. She said it the way you say something to a man you know won't listen. Not as a warning exactly, but as a record. Something to be noted in case it ever mattered later. Her uncle had gone up that same path 25 years earlier. His surveying rod was found at the spring. His pipe was found on the porch. His coat was hanging inside on the peg by the door. He was never found at all. The cabin sat on a dry shelf at the head of the hollow like it had been placed there by a deliberate hand. The porch was swept. The windows were whole. The door swung open without a creak, almost as if it had been expecting him. As if the hinges had been oiled by someone who knew, long before Wilkin started up that path, that he would one day push against them. Inside, a table was laid for 7. White china plates, forks turned tines down in the old country way. A candle burned to a black puddle of tallow, and the faint, unmistakable smell of beeswax, as though someone had polished every surface that very morning. What Wilkin Yarrow found inside that cabin was not a ghost story. Ghost stories are about the dead returning to the living. This was something far quieter than that, and far more patient. This was about the living being slowly, graciously, irresistibly invited to stop being the kind of people who leave. He found the diary first, then he found the names under the chairs, and the last name he found was his own. Freshly carved, the wood still pale at the cut, a tiny curl of shaving clinging to the letter W, as if it had only just been finished. Like someone had known he was coming, like someone had made a place for him at the table, long before he ever picked up this particular errand. Welcome back. If you found this channel for the first time tonight, let me tell you what kind of place you've stumbled into. This is not the kind of storytelling where the lights flash and the music screams and the jump scare does the heavy lifting. This is the other kind, the kind where the silence is the point, where the dread builds the way fog builds. Slowly, from the ground up, until you realize you can no longer see the road behind you, and you're not entirely sure you want to. The story you're about to hear is set in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in October of 1923. It is based on a case file so thin it nearly doesn't exist. A county assessor's report that was logged, dated, and then quietly misfiled in a drawer nobody opened again for 40 years. What was found when someone finally did is the reason we're here tonight. Before we go up that mountain, I want to ask you something. Hit that subscribe button right now before the story gets its hooks in you and you forget. It costs nothing. It takes 2 seconds. And it tells me there's someone out there in the dark who wants to keep hearing these. Drop a like if the kind of story that takes its time is the kind that keeps you up at night, and in the comments, tell me where in the world you're watching from. A city, a country, a county if you want to get specific. I read every single one. There's something about knowing that someone in a warm room 10,000 miles away is listening to the same darkness. It helps. Now then, let's go up the mountain. Wilkin Yarrow spent 20 years making the world legible, not as a career, as a discipline, a daily translation between the raw tangle of human circumstance and the clean language of the public record. Property changed hands, people died, disputes arose over fence lines and borrowed tools. Wilkin turned all of it into columns and ink. He believed the world's apparent mysteries dissolved on contact with sufficient paperwork. He was 38 that October, lean, slightly stooped from 2 decades over ledgers, his hair retreating at the crown and silver at the temples. Wire-rimmed spectacles sliding perpetually down his long nose, pushed back 100 times a day with one absent finger. A fountain pen callus worn into his right middle finger. Hands that had spent so many years recording other people's names, they carried the permanent faint smell of ink. He carried a leather satchel heavier than it looked. Inside, a stitched green notebook, a steel ruler, a bottle of ink, carbon paper, and a tin-type photograph of his late mother kept between 2 pieces of stiff card because the corners had begun to flake. He did not believe in luck. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in straight columns and the slow, sure mechanism of the law. The Whitlock folder was unusually thin. Most abandoned estates arrived with history, unpaid taxes, disputed boundaries, a neighbor's grievance. The Whitlocks had nothing. A deed from 1873, a marriage certificate from the same year, 2 death certificates, Cordelia, winter of 1921, Othmar, spring of 1922. Old age on both, no will, no heirs, no county correspondence for decades, a file that felt less like a record and more like the deliberate absence of one. He arrived in Hollow Bend on the late Tuesday train, in a rain moving without urgency. The town had the sadness of a place that had once expected more of itself. 2 churches where one would do, a bank with a stone face, storefronts with windows papered over from the inside in yellowed newspaper nobody had bothered to remove. The mountain stood on every side, leaning in, blocking whatever light remained. The boarding-house landlady, Mrs. Verlacrim, looked at his papers and then at him over her reading glasses, and her expression shifted, the small involuntary way a face shifts when an illness is mentioned in a family room. She handed him his room key, number 4, and watched him climb the stairs without another word. Wilkin noticed. He filed it away. County recorders are accustomed to all kinds of silences. In the morning he crossed to the general store and asked the proprietor, a heavy man named Crusin Mott, beard the color of wet ash, for directions to the old Whitlock Road. Crusin set down the can he was stacking, rested both palms flat on the counter, and was quiet for longer than the question warranted. Then he said, "Go up in the morning, come back before supper." Not advice. A courtesy. There was an old woman by the stove in a black dress mended at the cuffs. Nobody had brought her anything and she had asked for nothing, and Wilkin understood that the chair by the stove was simply hers. She wore her hair in a style fashionable when Wilkin was a boy. She had been listening from the beginning. She spoke without turning her head. Her uncle had been a surveyor. He went up the Whitlock path in 1898 with his rod and his pipe, told her mother he'd be back by sundown, and never returned. His rod was found at the spring, his pipe on the porch. His coat was on the peg inside the door, hung with the precision of a man who intended to come back for it. There had been no Pell Divine for 25 years. She turned her head and fixed Wilkin with the lightest eyes he had ever seen on a living person. "Don't eat at their table. Don't sit in their chairs. Don't stay past sundown." She said it the way you say something to a man who won't listen. Not a warning, but a record. Then she turned back to the stove and was finished with him. Wilkin walked out into the grey morning. His hands were not entirely steady. The man Wilkin hired to drive him was named Halsey Penny, about 50, face weathered into a permanent squint, wearing a hat so old its brim drooped on one side from pure accumulated weight. He spoke little during the 2 hours from Hollow Bend. The silence of a man who has decided there is nothing left to say about a particular subject is different from the silence of a man with nothing to say. Halsey's was the first kind. The road began as a real road, then a country road, then 2 wagon ruts in the leaves, then something the mountain was tolerating rather than maintaining. The trees grew older and taller the further in they went. Oaks and silent hemlocks and the occasional hollow skeleton of an ash that had given up. Old mountains hold their old timber the way old families hold their grief. Quietly, without explanation, and for longer than seems reasonable. At a creek crossing where the far bank rose into the first hollow, Halsey stopped and did not offer to go further. Not wouldn't, not couldn't, would not, with the flat precision of a man drawing a line already drawn in his mind. His horse stood with ears flat against her skull and nostrils flared wide, staring at the tree line with the fixed attention of an animal that can smell something it has no name for. Halsey said his grandfather had gone up that path once. He came back, which was more than some could claim, but he came back changed in one specific way every night for 18 years, until the night he died. He set an extra place at supper for someone nobody else could see. Nobody ever asked about it. He never explained. On his last evening, the family said, he looked at that empty chair and smiled in a way none of them had ever seen before. Wilkin climbed down. Halsey told him he would wait until the sun went behind the western ridge. Not 1 minute longer, and if Wilkin wasn't back by then, he'd return in the morning. He said it with the certainty of a man who had made peace with the outcome. Wilkin said he understood, crossed the creek, and did not look back. He didn't want to see what Halsey's face was doing. The path beyond the creek was steeper than it looked, and older than it felt. The mountain had been reclaiming it for decades. One root heave, one frost split, one season of leaf fall at a time. Wilkin climbed in the silence of a man trying to hold his thoughts in straight lines, and the forest came in around him the way deep hollow forests do. Not threatening, but utterly indifferent, the way very old things are indifferent to everything temporary. What stopped him was the absence of sound, not the ordinary quiet of a damp morning. That kind still has texture, rustles, distant water. This was the quiet inside a room sealed for a very long time. No birds, no insects. Nothing moved in the canopy or the leaf litter. Only the creak of his satchel strap and his own breathing, which seemed, in that absolute stillness, embarrassingly loud. An intrusion on something long undisturbed. He stopped and listened for a full minute. Nothing answered. Far overhead something shifted in the canopy, a faint rustle that could have been wind, except there was no wind, not the suggestion of one. He thought about Pell Devine, about the coat on the peg, about the rod at the spring. He told himself he did not believe a word of it. He told himself that 3 times, deliberately, the way a man repeats something he needs to be true. He came over a rise, and the cabin was simply there, appearing all at once, the way things that have been waiting for you appear, completely, as if held just out of sight until the precise moment you were close enough. Set on a flat shelf of land at the head of the hollow, ringed by old trees left deliberately standing. Long and low, chestnut logs darkened by weather, a stone chimney, a cedar shake roof worn to the color of old bone, every shingle whole. The porch was swept. That detail stopped him at the clearing's edge. The garden had gone entirely wild, nothing tended in over a year. But the porch had been swept. Sometime since Othmar had gone into the ground, someone had stood there with a broom and done the work of a living person. Wilkin set that fact in the back of his mind, the place where facts go when you are not yet ready to face what they mean, and walked forward. The cabin smelled of beeswax, not dust, not the stale air of a house abandoned for 1.5 years. Beeswax, the faint, clean smell of furniture polished by careful hands. Wilkin stood in the open doorway and breathed it in and understood, in the part of his mind that lived below language, that this was not right. that this was precisely the kind of detail that had no explanation he was prepared to offer. The room was long. Stone hearth at the far end. Kitchen at the near end. A table in the middle, and the table was set. 7 place settings. White china plates with a thin blue line painted around the rim, each adjusted with precision, as if someone had gone around afterward and nudged every single plate with one fingertip until it sat exactly right. Forks with tines turned down in the old country way. Cups upright and bone dry. Not a ring on a single one. In the center of the table, a wooden bowl with 3 apples. Brown, shrunken, long past any use. Beside it, a brass candle holder with the candle burned to almost nothing, a hardened pool of tallow spread dark around the base. Not old tallow. Recently burned. Wilkin took out his notebook and wrote down what he saw, because writing things down was what he did when the world became difficult. It gave it edges, gave it the manageable shape of something that could eventually be filed. He walked the room slowly. The hearth was cold, the walls intact, the window glass whole. He counted the chairs. 7 at the table, 1 rocker by the hearth with a folded wool throw over its back. He checked the bedroom. Bed made up with a green ring quilt, a chest at the foot, and a framed photograph hung above the headboard. The photograph showed a man and a woman standing stiffly in formal clothes. The woman small and dark-haired, hands folded, smiling just slightly despite an obvious instruction not to. The man taller, bearded, with pale eyes, the tintype process, had turned almost white. On the back in careful pencil, Cordelia and Othmar Whitlock, 1876. Wilkin read it, put the photograph back exactly as he'd found it, and returned to the main room. On the mantelpiece, between 2 pewter candlesticks, a small book in brown leather with a black silk ribbon marking a page past the middle. A diary. Inside the cover, in faded ink, Cordelia Hennick Whitlock. Began this 4th of April, 1881. He sat in the rocker, the only chair not at the table, and opened it at the beginning because that was the kind of man he was. The early entries were entirely ordinary. Weather, flour prices, a difficult hen, a neighbor who came to borrow thread. The texture of a quiet life documented without any awareness of being documented. Wilkin skimmed through years of it. Then, in a spring entry from 1886, the handwriting slowed slightly, and Cordelia wrote, "A man came up the path today. His name was Asher Quill. His feet were blistered. He hadn't eaten since the morning before." Othmar set a place for him at the table. Asher Quill stayed the night, then 3 nights, then the harvest, then the diary stopped mentioning him as someone who might leave and started mentioning him the way you mention furniture, assumed, present, requiring no further explanation. Othmar kept his chair set. The mountain, Othmar said, had settled into him. Some men come up and cannot quite go back down. It is not a sadness. They simply become part of it. There were others. A peddler in 1889. A man named Holcomb in 1893. A woman, Iolanthe Spry, in 1896. And Pell Devine in 1898, who had a sad way of looking at the trees, who stayed for supper, stayed the night, and then stayed in the same slow, undeclared way all the others had stayed. Each one faded from the diary, not with any announcement, but with a gradual dimming. Like a candle going out so slowly you cannot say exactly when it has gone. By the late 1890s, Cordelia was recording only the table count. 9, 11, 14. Wilkin sat very still and read, and his pocket watch ticked inside his coat. He came to the last entry in her hand, spring of 1921, Othmar setting the table for 7 now, the rest having gone on. Gone on where? Only a smile in answer. Below it, in heavy pencil, Othmar's hand. Cordelia has gone to her rest. I will keep setting the table. They will want her at supper. He should have left then. He knew it, the way the body knows things before the mind catches up. a tightness across the chest, a coolness along the back of the neck, the particular alertness his peripheral vision had begun paying to the corners of the room. He should have put the diary back on the mantelpiece, picked up his satchel, and walked out the door at the fastest pace his legs would give him. He knew this clearly. Instead, he bent down and touched the underside of the nearest chair. He had been half expecting it, the way a conclusion waits at the end of reasoning you haven't quite finished. His fingertips found the carved letters before his mind had registered it was looking for them. He turned the chair onto its side, careful not to disturb the plate above, and read the names cut into the wood beneath the seat. 6 of them, carved with the patient craft of a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. Asher Quill, 1886. Lot Fruin, 1889. Holcomb, no first name. 1893. Iolanthe Spry, 1896. Pell Devine, 1898. And at the bottom, in letters slightly fresher than the rest, the wood still pale at the cut, Beulah Krim, 1921. He stared at them for a long time. Then he set the chair back upright with the same precision with which he had turned it and moved to the next. Every chair had names beneath it. Some had 4, some had 8. One had 12 names running in 2 columns because one column had not been enough. The names went back to 1878 and came forward year by year in the neat, patient record of a man who believed that carving a name into wood was the act of keeping something permanently true. He understood, as he went around the table, that the years beneath the chairs were not the years the names had arrived. Those years were in the diary. The years carved in the wood were always later. They were the year each name stopped being a person moving through the world and became instead a presence at the table. The year of something Cordelia's diary, never named directly, but always wrote around. The way you write around the center of a thing you cannot bring yourself to face. He came to the chair at the head of the table last. He turned it with the same care he had used on all the others. He read from the top down, oldest to most recent, the way a careful record always runs. The names meant nothing to him individually, not the way the diary names had meant something. They were simply letters pressed into aged wood by a patient blade. He read through them one by one until he reached the bottom of the list. The last entry was not old. The wood was still pale, almost white against the darker grain, the contrast of a cut made recently, within the last month perhaps. There was still, caught at the edge of the letter W, a tiny curl of shaved wood that should have fallen off on its own long ago, but had not. He leaned closer. He read W. Yarrow, 1923. 7 place settings. 6 names beneath this chair. His name was the 7th. He looked at his own name for a long time. He noticed the care in the carving, the same even pressure, the same clean lines as every other name on every other chair in the room. He noticed the year was this year, not last year, not a decade ago. This year, the year still happening, the year not yet finished. He turned the chair back upright and placed it at the head of the table exactly as he had found it. He crossed to the door with a hand moving very deliberately, the way hands move when the body is managing them carefully. He thought in clean, sequential steps. Pick up the satchel, open the door, walk down the mountain, reach the creek before dark. One step, then the next. He reached for the latch. He already knew before his fingers touched it. The door was closed. He had left it open. He was certain of it with the certainty of things done without thinking, which is the most reliable kind there is. He stood very still with his hand on the latch, and from somewhere behind him, from the direction of the table, came the very quiet, very deliberate sound of a chair being drawn slowly back from its place. He did not turn around. That was the thing about Wilkin Yarrow that mattered most in that moment. Not courage, because it wasn't courage. His body simply refused to turn. It had run out of the kind of control that requires courage and had fallen back on something older and more animal. Stillness. His hand stayed on the latch. His eyes stayed on the wood grain of the closed door. He counted the small cracks in it. 6. Then 7. Then he opened the door. The porch held light that had changed completely while he was inside. Not dark yet, but the deep amber of late October, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, because you know exactly what comes after it. The trees at the clearing's edge were already in shadow. The sky to the west had gone the color of an old bruise where the last of the sun pressed against the clouds before giving up. The light of a man who had already used most of his time. His pocket watch said 10 minutes to 5. He went down the 3 stone steps without running, because running was something he could not allow himself. If he ran, he would know what he was running from. He kept his pace to the steady walk of a man finishing his day's work, heading toward lamplight and supper. He crossed the clearing. He entered the tree line. He did not look back at the cabin. He thought about the names under the chairs, how each one had entered Cordelia's diary as a living person. Someone with blistered feet, someone with a sad way of looking at the trees, and had then, over weeks or months, simply stopped being someone who might leave, had become instead a presence at the table, a name carved beneath a chair by hands that believed the plate and the cup and the wood were enough to hold what had once been a person. He thought about the 7 settings and his name as the 7th, and the door closed when he had not closed it. He thought about the sound of the chair. He thought about Halsey's grandfather, who came back down the mountain and set an empty place at supper every night for 18 years and smiled at it on the last night of his life. He thought about all of these things, and the trees went on forever, and the light died in increments above the canopy. The path went down. He went with it. His breathing was loud in the stillness, and his satchel creaked against his hip, and nothing else made any sound in the whole long hollow. No bird, no insect, no breath of wind. Just his footsteps and his own heartbeat in his ears, which had become, in the last hour, the most reliable sound he knew. He did not count minutes. He counted footsteps instead, because footsteps had a direction and minutes did not. He heard the creak before he saw it. The small, ordinary sound of moving water, which was the most beautiful sound he had heard in his entire life. He came over the last bank, and Halsey Penny was still there, barely. Horse already turned toward home, wagon already angled downslope. Halsey looked at him in the particular way you look at a man when you need to check whether he is still himself. Then he said quietly, "Did you finish your work?" Wilkin thought about his notebook. The measurements not taken, the valuation left incomplete, the report his supervisor would question on Monday morning. He thought about all of it. Then he thought about his name carved pale and fresh beneath the head chair, and the tiny curl of shaving still clinging to the letter W like a question not yet answered. He climbed up into the wagon. He said, "Drive." That night at the boarding house, Wilkin sat at the small desk for a long time without writing. Then he opened his notebook and wrote 4 lines. The date, the property address, 1 sentence. Value cannot be determined. Recommend the county make no claim, and nothing else. He sat by the window, lamp burning low. Then, with no reason he could name, he reached across and cleared a small space at the corner of the desk, just large enough for a single plate. He did not put anything there. He went to bed. In the morning, the space was still clear, and he left it that way. Left it that way for the rest of his life. That small, patient, empty corner of every desk he ever worked at. Nobody ever asked about it. He never explained. But every evening, before closing up, he would pause and look at that empty space the way you look at something you have made a promise to. Quietly, and with a patience that had no visible end. Wilkin Yarrow returned to the county office on Monday. He filed his report. He recommended no claim be made. His supervisor noted the file as incomplete and, for reasons nobody ever fully explained, set the folder in a drawer nobody opened again for 40 years. When someone finally did, they found the assessment exactly as Wilkin had left it. 4 lines. 2 of which were the date and the address. They filed it as a cold case. They never sent anyone else up that path. The Whitlock property was never formally assessed. Never sold. never transferred into any other name. If you look at the deed records for that part of Greenbrier County today, the parcel still sits exactly as it was registered in 1873. 50 acres of timber, one good spring, one bad slope, belonging on paper to no one. No logging company has ever filed a claim on those old-growth acres. No developer has ever surveyed the land. Some things in the mountains of West Virginia simply remain unclaimed, and the mountains seem, on the whole, to prefer it that way. Some roads don't need to lock the door behind you. They simply wait. They sweep the porch. They set the table. They carve the chair. And they trust that what they're offering, warmth, stillness, a place that holds you without asking anything in return, will be enough, eventually, for the right traveler on the right dark autumn evening to decide that going back down is more effort than it's worth. Wilkin Yarrow went back down, but that empty corner of his desk was there until the last day of his life. Whoever cleared his belongings afterward reported, without knowing what they were looking at, that the corner had been left completely empty, as if it were being held for someone who hadn't arrived yet.